But when
Hmm.
Jamal Khashoggi, a guy that they'd been at cocktail parties with, was killed, it was all of a sudden a big deal. This was maybe 6 months ago. Jose Andres got really angry that some of his people had gotten blown up, and Joe Biden, probably for the only time, actually called up Netanyahu and was like, listen, mofo. And that was one of the best months for aid provision in the course of the war, indicating really that if Joe Biden were ever serious about actually pressuring Netanyahu into doing anything, it would have been done.
Hello, and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Rory, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time, Robert?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Well, heck, I'm excited, Rory. I guess this will be broadcasting after Thanksgiving weekend, but as we're recording this the Tuesday before, we're getting ready for the Thanksgiving weekend festivities here in the United States. Nobody agrees with us on Thanksgiving. I think Canada has a Thanksgiving, but it's in October. It's my favorite U.S. holiday by far. Talking it over with some Germans last weekend, and it's like, yeah, it's just sort of like Christmas, except you don't have to buy anybody anything.
Oh, okay. That's it. I never thought of it like that. It does seem like a little mini Christmas, similar sort of
Yeah.
food and meeting up with people.
Yeah, it's always been a priority in my family. You're allowed to skip if Thanksgiving if you're fighting in a war. There's
Okay.
no other way.
All right.
So nobody's missed since Vietnam. So
Well, would you like some good news, Rob?
sure.
You were a big fan of the TV show Wolf Hall, am I right?
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Well, there's a second season.
You're kidding.
No.
Huh.
It's
Oh, that's
currently
really
on the
great
BBC,
news.
so I'm sure it'll come to America soon enough.
Oh, it's already out.
Yeah, there's episodes
Oh,
out.
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, because there were 2 seasons already, I thought, so is this
Okay.
a new season?
Yeah, a new
recorded
season.
Well, that's phenomenal. I did not know that, Rory. Thank
Yeah.
you. That is
I was
that is
hoping you
worthwhile.
didn't, and it would give you a wee surprise.
That is a wee positive surprise at the start of a very not positive episode. Wolf Hall is a really fascinating series of novels. I think won the Man Booker Prize, was turned into as rarely happens with extraordinarily good books, was turned into what I believe to be an extraordinarily good television show. It's historically based. It's sort of, you wouldn't think there was anything new to say about the Tudors.
Yeah.
Famous Henry VIII with his 6 wives and that whole thing. But actually to tell the story from the viewpoint of Thomas Cromwell, who is this enigmatic but sort of acknowledged even at the time to be shockingly powerful commoner who managed to get Henry VIII's favor for a number of years and then lost it. And it's sort of a brilliant book talking about how insanely capable this person had to be, and a great television show. I can't recall what the actor's name is, but really just brilliant stuff. Yeah, I'd highly recommend it to anybody who has not seen it. The sort of reign of Henry VIII is really kind of fascinating and gets sort of known for the wrong things. There are a lot of things that are happening there, the Renaissance, sort of the shift from more medieval kinging to sort of early modern monarchy. And we usually spend a lot of time focusing on who he was bedding and then killing, and less on like sort of the actual historical merit of it. And I think that Wolf Hall, the books, and the TV show do a pretty great job of illuminating all that.
Stars Mark Rylance and Damian Lewis.
Mark Rylance. Yeah, Mark Rylance is phenomenal. Oh, Damian Lewis is the Billions guy as Henry VIII.
Yes. Okay.
And
yeah.
I think now, I'm not sure if I'm wrong about this, but I think Anne Boleyn is the actress who then went on to play Queen Elizabeth on the Crown television show
it is,
as a
yes.
youngster.
Mhm.
Anyway, brilliant TV. You should watch it. That's something positive to take out of this episode.
Well, I thought since Trump's coming in, we would do like a sort of honor list of all the wonderful things Biden has done in his tenure.
Yes, yeah, what a great guy, that Joe Biden. What I think one of the great things we've learned this month is a clarification of sort of a historical mystery. It has sort of resolved something. Is Joe Biden at the mercy of IPAC? Is he just this doddering old guy who felt like he had to just kowtow to Israel because of the election? Was he just he'd love to do more. He's secretly seething at Netanyahu. He's
Mhm.
secretly so angry at Netanyahu, and
Yeah.
he's bitching him out all the time. Or is that actually all just nonsense, as I've been maintaining? And is Joe Biden actually just a kind of a bloodthirsty monster?
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Yes, we'd have had to invent it. That's a Joe Biden quote from what, decades back or something?
Yeah,
along
he
those
looks like
lines?
he's from the 80s, but it could be the 90s. But yeah, it's definitely not a recent Joe Biden that would struggle to make such a sentence.
Yeah, it does seem in the decayed pea soup that is Joe Biden's mind. It does seem, for whatever reason, I don't know if I can diagnose it. The concept that he's held onto is slavish loyalty to the worst instincts of Israeli politics, and he has no. It wasn't about the election. It wasn't about pressure from perhaps, Israel lobby affiliated donors or something along those lines. Joe Biden is now in his lame duck period. He can do whatever he wants. Famously, Barack Obama, in this similar period, he was handing off to Trump, basically, I think finally, simply abstained from a UN Security Council resolution on settlements. This is a period of time when Israel was not, in fact, engaged in, some leftist agitators would disagree, but this was not when Obama was allowing a UN Security Council resolution to go forward. He was not, Israel was not, in fact, engaged in a genocide. Israel today absolutely is. It is clear. It has been shouted from the rooftops by South Africa, by the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is an incredibly slow-moving organization, yet saw fit to, I said, probably the only time they've issued a sort of reckoning of any kind within the same year that the complaint was made.
Yeah.
I think complaint, is again common law U.S. terminology, not the terminology that they use. But regardless, the proceedings were started, and the ICJ saw fit to, their determination of whether or not this is a genocide will take a decade. But they actually saw fit to issue a sort of preliminary ruling or injunction saying that Israel must stop doing this stuff that smells like a genocide, which is, of course, construed by some as, oh, well, see, they didn't say we were doing a genocide. But if you actually know how any of this works, it's an extremely strong condemnation. This is becoming every red line that the Biden administration has set has been blown through. And when the Security Council, really, I think over the course of November, attempted for the fourth time to come up with a resolution that the United States would be either okay with, attach its name to, which nobody really expected, or just have the decency to abstain from, to allow the very real outrage of the entire world, all of the other 14 members of the UN Security Council, and the majority of the United States of America, including the majority of Jewish Americans.
Yes.
Joe Biden said, nah, I want more dead children. I refuse to slow down in any way my lust for the blood of dead Palestinians.
Has there been any change in mainstream media as far as you can see? Like, does CNN or Fox or anything push anything other than Israel's the greatest thing ever, and anyone that says otherwise is anti-Semitic?
Well, that's a very complicated question. It's not that simple and that straightforward. The New York Times has rightly been castigated for having a absurdly pro-Israel line, not just in their editorial content, but also in their reporting and the way that they'll talk about Israelis being killed and or massacred or savagely, brutally killed, whereas the Palestinians are just sort of bombed by somebody. Who
They
knows?
just seem to exist like a
Yeah,
fungus.
but they just sort of blew up, terrible, terrible, terrible. But at the same time, like the New York, and this is why I can, despite the incredible racism and sort of refusal to condemn genocide that I see from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, I am a subscriber to all of these august print institutions because all of those institutions take journalism seriously enough that they still have real journalists and powerful people. I mean, let's be clear, powerful people at those newspapers who are instrumental in forming this anti-Palestinian line, who also are committed enough to the idea of journalism that they are funding pretty extraordinary work at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I can think of significant articles at all three that are part of the reason South Africa has such a compelling case for Israeli genocide.
Okay.
So that it's not quite so simple-minded as, and which is why I don't flip out. Just as recently as this week, the Washington Post put out a truly disgusting editorial, just being like, well, Israelis, I mean, it's not exactly what they said, but it's essentially Israelis are white people who are affiliated with the United States. How dare the International Criminal Court come after them?
Wow.
Of course, it means so much less when they murdered, 45 to 200,000 people than when, Hamas, this street gang, murdered 700 innocent Israelis. To clarify what I'm saying there, because I think 1,200 is the number that people go with, the Israeli soldiers, as we have had demonstrated very clearly for the past year, are not innocents.
You're referring to the civilian number.
Yes, the civilian number, which is between 700 and 800 Israeli innocents murdered on October 7th. And we have easily, the lowest bound possible is 44,000 Palestinians savagely murdered by Israel.
Yeah, but the fact that that number hasn't changed would suggest that they're unable to identify the bodies at this point.
And stop me if we've covered this, but I think it's worthwhile covering this again. And I will definitely do a produced video on this at some point in the new year, when we're talking about Joe Biden's just incredible guilt and just what an evil human being Joe Biden is for allowing this to go forward.
Yeah.
The way that we talk about conflicts, the way that we talk about Yemen, Syria is a little different because we had a lot more granular information on the ground thanks to institutions like the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights. But Yemen, Ethiopia, Sudan, these horrific conflicts in very poor countries, there are numbers that we have that are very solid that we know about. And then the estimates of how many people were killed. The UN estimate of how many people were killed in Yemen is 377,000. The estimate of how many people were killed in the war between the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayans is a truly staggering 600,000 people. And what organizations like The Atlantic, what apologists for Israel like to do is compare that 45,000, I think is the sort of acknowledged number of, basically, and this is much like the Syrian war, extremely granular, detailed data. These are actually individual names that we have Israeli provided identification numbers for. That's 45,000 dead, acknowledged, reported on
absolute, no argument.
Palestinians, 70% of which are women and children. And what defenders of this like to say is, well, that's just 44,000 Palestinians. Look at the 377,000 Yemenis who died, or the 600,000. You see, the thing is, that 377,000 Yemenis, or that 600,000 Ethiopians, those are estimates that include the numbers of people that starved to death or victims of diseases. Essentially, that's like excess deaths. You'll remember that from COVID, right? Just like the whole number of...
All the four horsemen are involved in this.
Exactly. So what people are doing who are trying to say that Ethiopia or Sudan or Yemen are worse is they're taking the four horsemen number and comparing it to the direct, these are people we know were actually killed by this actor number.
Yeah.
I was absolutely stunned recently reading an Ethiopia book, and the actual number, the directly comparable number between how many people the Israeli government killed and how many people the Ethiopian forces are acknowledged to have directly killed in Tigray. The Ethiopian military forces killed directly about a quarter as many people as Israel has been acknowledged to have killed directly over
That's
the past year.
terrifying.
So actually, Israel's like 4 times worse, and we've only had a few passing stories that nobody pays any attention to. The Lancet said, not as any kind of conclusive number, but looking at the numbers, the Lancet said, yeah, we'd expect there's probably something in the order of 200,000 Gazans killed. So something like 10% of Gaza. This is not blown up by Israel, but this is Gazans killed by very direct things that the U.S. government, multiple branches of the U.S. government have acknowledged that Israel is doing, which is blocking aid. Essentially starving people to death and making it much more likely that they'll die
Was there
of
not
disease.
like aid trucks recently attacked by Israelis that were queuing up to go in?
This has been a constant theme across. There are, there's a number of different things going on here. Within Israel itself, there are protesters that stop those trucks at the borders. There are also very heroic Israelis really braving the condemnation of the majority of the Israeli population, heroic Israelis who work to facilitate those aid trucks going in. That's very worth mentioning. And yes, the Israeli military has over and over and over and over again been demonstrated to attack. The one time that it mattered to Joe Biden, the one time, and it was interesting how quickly the situation was changed, was when the Israeli military blew up a bunch of Americans and Europeans that were working for World Central Kitchen, which is apparently the NGO funded by one of Washington, D.C.'s most popular chefs. So because
Wow.
Joe Biden knew, it's very similar to the fact that the hundreds of thousands that Saudi Arabia was killing in Yemen didn't really matter to the Washington, D.C. elites. But when Jamal Khashoggi, a guy that they'd been at cocktail parties with, was killed, it was all of a sudden a big deal. This was maybe 6 months ago. Jose Andres got really angry that some of his people had gotten blown up, and Joe Biden, probably for the only time, actually called up Netanyahu and was like, listen, mofo. And then and that was one of the best months for aid provision in the course of the war, indicating really that if Joe Biden were ever serious about actually pressuring Netanyahu into doing anything, it would have been done.
Oh yeah, it's a situation that America has essentially full control over.
Full control has dramatically certainly more control than what we've portrayed.
Also, more control than the rest of the world, it seems.
Oh, more control than certainly more control. I mean, actually, no. I think you're like more control. Joe Biden has vastly more control over what gets done to Gaza than the Israeli government does. That's the key point here. Vastly more, and has chosen at every point to just keep fire hosing money. In a normal year, we give Israel $3 billion. This past year, for sure, we have given them $14 billion in addition.
Wow.
And I've seen some estimates that sort of say, things that are falling off the truck, surplus stuff that we've shunted to them, this, that, and the other thing. It's maybe as high as $22 billion over the past year.
And also when you consider like there's US planes and NATO planes flying around to protect Israel on top of its own defenses, it's the true cost of this will be outstanding.
Yeah, and the horror show that's currently happening in
Lebanon
is all those bombs that are knocking down all of those apartment buildings on top of all these people that certainly didn't carry out October 7th.
Oh yeah.
That's all U.S. bombs that we've provided over the past year. It's quite disgusting, and so this is really just lust for blood on Joe Biden's part. The way it goes, the way it has gone in the 2006 war, in every sort of instance of Netanyahu, the horrific term they use is mowing the grass in Gaza. Just sort of every 3 to 5 years, there's some kind of thing. And Hamas is a stupid organization that usually provides good excuses for this. Of course, Hamas was preserved in power primarily by Benjamin Netanyahu and his ilk in Israel. Usually every 3 to 5 years, there's some big excuse for Israel to go kill hundreds or thousands of Gazans. Seems pedestrian compared to what's been happening over the past year, but it has provided a model of what happens, and it's been established certainly in this century, but going back to the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, that the way this works is really quite simple. The Israeli government goes nuts, it does savage things by the standards of the day. Today's standards are much lower. Does that for a period of time and the U.S. government sort of, it's like, well, okay, maybe Israel has a good reason to be angry about this, and sort of lets it go for a little while. And then at a certain point, usually about a month or two in, the U.S. government goes, stop it. And it is specifically the U.S. president goes, stop it. We've all at this point read the accounts of Ronald Reagan's angry messages to, was it Menachem Begin at that point? That sort of instantly changed the nature of Israel's assault on Lebanon. Didn't end it, but meant that they stopped doing certain kinds of things. We've read accounts of George W. Bush taking whoever the Israeli prime minister was at that point to task over 5 or 10 dead Palestinian children. Joe Biden has resolutely refused to do that for over a year. It's truly nightmarish. There's no disputing that October 7th was a horror of a scale that the Israeli people have not seen for quite some time. And we talked about it at the time. It was like, it is inevitable that we're going to see horrific things done to Palestine. And there's not even really a point to trying to stop it. It's inevitable. They're going to go in and kill 10 times as many people as were killed. That's just going to happen as much as we'd like it to not happen. We're now at a point where they have killed, conservatively 50 times as many people as were killed, if not 100 times as many people as were killed. And there's no sign of stopping. And it's a very open question whether or not it'll stop under the Trump administration. There was a ceasefire in November of 2023 that lasted for a week that just never gets mentioned at all anymore, during which 100 Israeli and Israeli-affiliated hostages were released. That was, if you really wanted hostages to come home, that was how you did it. That was clear. That was obvious. And this is the way that sort of U.S. media bias works. To go back to your earlier question, nobody says that. It's like this week-long ceasefire that instantly brought home 100 hostages is just completely forgotten and is never mentioned in any story, in any sort of summing up. It's just this thing that didn't, and people are allowed to say, oh, well, we care about the hostages. And if you want the bloodshed to stop, you don't care about the hostages. And you're like, well, it's like, well, what was the action that was taken by the United States and Israel that brought back the most hostages? And I think perhaps if Obama had been president, if Bush had been president, that would have been the point at which the bloodletting stopped.
Bernie.
And honestly,
imagine if he was president.
What's that? Well, if Bernie was president, then there probably wouldn't have been an October 7th in the first place, because there actually would have been a U.S. president who was interested in the peace process and giving the Palestinians a voice, which there really hasn't been since. Honestly, it's funny, George W. Bush. Actually, Obama was okay, but he was completely sort of end-run around by the Republican Congress and Netanyahu. And I think it's worth mentioning, Rory, the extent to which, obviously it's nowhere near as important as what's happening to the Palestinians. This is really bad for Israel.
Oh, definitely.
Netanyahu is apparently now popular again. And I believe, actually, I have read the accounts about how angry Israelis are and how hurt Israelis are, and how the Israeli public has gone through a massive sort of experience of trauma that has filled them with a lust for blood. I remember this in the aftermath of 9/11, and there was nobody to tell it. Well, actually, the Germans and the French and the Russians tried, but there was nobody to tell us to just stop. But for the United States, it doesn't matter, because we are, Israel is, for generations, turning every Arab, most Europeans, and most of the world against them. I get it. No, I don't need this explained to me again. I get it that the Israeli voter is really traumatized by October 7th and believes that Israel is in incredible danger, and the only way to deal with this incredible danger is to do genocide in Gaza and knock down every building in Lebanon. I get that the Israeli voter believes that. They're wrong. Israel is not in danger. The most dangerous thing that is happening to Israel right now is the wholesale destruction of its international reputation that is being carried out by the Israeli government. A normal U.S. president would say that, would be able to say that, and would be able to figure out how to rein
Israel in.
an Israeli government in. And that is not something that Joe Biden has chosen to do. It's been quite explicit and like horrifying. In mid-October, for the first time, it seemed as though the Israeli government, the U.S. government was setting a real line and making a real ultimatum. It was a bit absurd that we gave them like a month, but this is in October 13th, the Biden administration came out. Anthony Blinken, I guess, joined with Lloyd Austin. I think it was a joint Department of Defense letter that was sent on Sunday, October 13th, and then publicly acknowledged on Wednesday, October 15th, saying that we have identified that the aid situation in Gaza, specifically northern Gaza, which most people recognize as a pretty explicit ethnic cleansing that is ongoing right now. This is unacceptable. Even Anthony Blinken said so. And they gave him a month to fix the situation, or the U.S. attitude towards providing arms for Israel would be reevaluated. They lost the election. That deadline came on, and the day before that deadline was going to expire, on Tuesday, November 12th, the U.S. State Department somewhat shamefacedly came out and said, yeah, we're not going to do anything. And of course, the situation hasn't changed. So it was exclusively for the election, a sort of last-ditch attempt to perhaps save Michigan or get Kamala a few more votes. And then this is the mystery being solved. This is like the big question, like, does, maybe Biden just had this old school idea that, he couldn't get reelected or couldn't get Kamala elected without the support of these hyper-Zionist donors or something, and it was just for the election. Like, no, this is actually what Joe Biden believes. Joe Biden truly believes that that genocide is somehow appropriate, that this is somehow okay, and it's not. It's horrifying, and it is covering myself and every other U.S. taxpayer with an extraordinary moral stain that exceeds actually what we did to Iraq.
But you can't be sending all that money to Ukraine. Like, it's best that it goes to Israel.
Goes to genocide.
So Israel can survive, because it needs to survive. And how dare you say otherwise, Rob?
Yeah, good. Yeah, well put. You've convinced me. You've convinced me. It is interesting the way that I think that there's a lot of people who think that, actually a lot of people who will say this explicitly, Republicans saying that, well, gosh, we send all this money to Ukraine, and it's just absurd. Like, and I guess it is about the point we can move on from Israel to Ukraine. The Ukraine-Russia conflict is on such a higher plane, morally, physically, logistically, than what is happening in Israel. I mean, Israel is, in the final analysis, a very small country that is genociding. It is slightly higher tone, but it is just actually, frankly, much more disgusting than a bunch of folks, than what we saw in Rwanda in 1990, just a bunch of folks running around with machetes. This is a little more higher tone, but it's just a vile little ghetto clearance. And it is absurd that people compare Israel deciding to murder a whole bunch of its subjects, spend a year murdering a whole bunch of its subjects with, absurdly expensive kit, to what we are funding in Ukraine, which is the self-defense of a country of 40 million against a country of 120 million, involving more serious state-on-state conflict than we have seen since Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. I do not, as will become clear and has been made clear recently on this episode, I am not in favor of a blank check to Ukraine. But let's be clear about the incredible moral difference of what we're doing in Ukraine. It is an infinitely better thing. I mean, honestly, supporting Ukraine, despite the fact that we created the situation that they were put into, is like the most morally just thing that the United States has done this century. But logistically, it's just a different scale of thing. Like it's like comparing like Stalingrad to like, helping the camp guards at Auschwitz, which is what's happening. I shouldn't make those. I feel like if I make those comparisons that directly, I'm going to have trouble having people see this episode. But yeah.
But it reminds me more of like how America treated the Native Americans. Like it's just like, yeah, we'll sign some paperwork, and if you ever, because there were times the Native Americans would kill some American civilians, and then that was used as an excuse to just do some more genocide. Like I feel like it's on that scale.
I agree that it is that sort of same, we'll pretend you can live here for a while and then we'll decide you can't, which is definitely describes just sort of the start-stop genocide that the United States inflicted on Native Americans. But there's really an industrial nature to what Israel is doing that is unlike, I do think that Rwanda is worse than what Israel is doing to the
definitely.
Gazans. I do think that like the Congo in the 90s at least is worse than, but like,
But there's also less Palestinians to kill.
yes. But the problem is that to find an analogy of the truly industrial scale of killing that is being done, you kind of do have to go back to Germany in the 1940s, which is not something I'm really hesitant to make those analogies, because I feel like making those analogies like is sort of a guarantee that my content won't be seen on any algorithm. But yeah, no, it's the power dynamic is such that it's and that actually is also very similar to the United States genocides, because it's just there's no threat here. There's no actual threat here.
We were told like Russia's this ultimate evil. I remember the time where they bombed it's basically a lot of children were sheltering in a concert hall, and this was portrayed for months as like the worst thing that could possibly happen.
This is in Mariupol.
And it feels like it's hard to find a day where Israel hasn't murdered as many children.
Yeah.
And then it's just like,
there isn't one. There isn't
it's
one.
just like you've made Russia look good, Israel. Like the horrors that go on, I deliberately try to avoid, because I heard something about like surgeon in Gaza was raped to death. Like any snippet from it's just a horror factory. It's hard to comprehend it in any way similar to what Ukraine's going through.
Russia and Ukraine are having a war. Israel is throwing an extermination on its own subjects.
Mhm.
That's what's going on. That's the real contrast here. So while I am not as just incensed and horrified by what Joe Biden is doing in Israel, has been doing to the Gazans for the past year plus, I do think that there's no question that he is using his lame duck period. Everyone's familiar with that term, right? The
Yes.
lame
Well,
duck
I've heard
period.
people even talking about Donald Trump as a lame duck, because technically he is, but it's hard to call it his lame duck period when he's not even in office yet.
Well, he's got some midterms to win, and he's got a whole
Mhm.
4 years as president and an agenda to put forward. But that is a really interesting dynamic that Obama did have, whereas Obama after 2014, you could start talking about Obama as a lame duck. And he did some of the most courageous and worthwhile stuff of his presidency during that lame duck period between 2014 and 2016 after his last midterm election. Iran nuclear deal, the opening to Cuba. And honestly, he, for the first time, began to start talking about U.S. criminal justice, which is a very worthwhile topic as well. But yeah, that is interesting that it does seem as if, and it'd be fascinating if, I'd be surprised if J.D. Vance makes it 3 months into the Trump presidency, still as a darling of the Trump family. But it does seem as though the Trump family has decided that J.D. Vance, part of the reason that J.D. Vance was picked is because he's a possible standard bearer, is seen as not just some neocon Chamber of Commerce freak who's sort of kissing up to Trump for a while. It's like J.D. Vance has done a good job of portraying himself as like, no, I'm actually like a true Trump Republican, and I am going to take the party in new places. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if that narrative survives March.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very interesting times, I'm afraid. But to bring us back to Ukraine, like it seemed to be America was spending more on Afghanistan. American soldiers were being killed in Afghanistan, and for a lot of that war, nobody talked about it.
Yeah.
But for the large part, Ukraine's getting America's old cast-offs, and no American soldiers are being. Obviously, there's American civilians that have signed up to the international brigade, but no American soldiers are being killed in this. It's a bunch of old tech, and they just buy themselves the new equipment. But it's the worst thing in the world, apparently, if you talk to some media organizations.
Well, unquestionably, the commitment to Ukraine is smaller than what we did in Afghanistan at its height. But that's a key distinction there, at its height. In the initial invasion, in the initial years, and an Obama's utterly worthless, obscenely expensive surge that I think was sort of 2009 to 2011 or thereabouts,
Yeah.
Afghanistan was astronomically more expensive than anything the U.S. military had done other than Iraq. In its final years, I don't have the figures at my
Okay.
fingertips,
The-
but I'd imagine that
Okay.
we'd probably been putting a little bit more into Ukraine over the past couple of years than we had put into Afghanistan in the last
The
years.
figures I have, but obviously there's so many different institutes that can cherry pick. For 10 years from 2001 to 20 years, 2001 to 2021, it's estimated at 2.1 trillion for
Yeah.
Afghanistan, and
Mhm.
Ukraine is around 111 billion so far. But it's hard to know with these figures.
But that's the key thing, is that like that 2.1 trillion for Afghanistan was pretty much done by, say, 2014. And between 2014 and 2021, I don't know exactly what the figures are, but I would imagine our contribution to Afghanistan each year was either around the, say, 50 billion a year average we're giving to Ukraine, or even like 10, 15 billion a year less. But I take your point. Like it's clearly like we are, again, I have a lot. I don't think war between Russia and Ukraine is something we should be doing,
No.
and I think we helped to create it, but it's obviously far more morally just than the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, or the genocide we're facilitating in Israel. I 100% agree with you on that. The problem with the escalation is a problem, and I know that we differ on this. I differ with most of the patrons' Discord on this, but I really, 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 really don't like the idea that we are funding and arming a massive proxy force that is in a war with, certainly not a war they started, certainly a war that Russia started, in a war with the only other country on the planet that can wipe out human civilization. I am always appalled when I see people minimizing the threat of World War III and nuclear apocalypse. And I think it does kind of come into Joe Biden's general attitude that he is sort of willy-nilly escalating this fight in his lame
Because
duck period.
recently they've got the go-ahead to use ATACMS, which are the rockets that have a much larger range inside Russian territory. Because I think the argument was the Russian bombers could take off within Russia, let off their bombs, and they could just glide their way nicely into Ukraine. So if you're able to attack those airports in Russia, then it makes things so much harder for Russia, because then they have to use airports even further away. But yes, the more attacking into Russia might make Russia go, Russia proper is under threat, fire the nukes.
I saw a really horrifying. It's because I get it. Like I have the same thrill when I see plucky little Ukraine having a victory. Like I get it. Like, but at the same time, it's really horrifying. Like there is footage. This has only been policy for 2 weeks at this point, and there is footage of one of the Russia's really high-end air defense systems, the S-300, or is it the S-400?
S-400,
blown
yeah.
up by a U.S. ATACMS missile in Russia. And that is terrifying. That is how, imagine if Cuba was blowing up Florida air defense.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
If that had happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy would have pushed the button and the world would be done. And I get it. I get it. Russia chose to invade the neighbor, but this stuff strikes me as insane. And to be clear, the ATACMS it's only certain parts of Russia, right? We can't, but, and that's great. That's good. It's sort of restrained, but again, U.S. proxy forces are dropping U.S. missiles on Russian territory. It just seems crazy to me. Now to qualify this a bit, it is in the grand tradition of presidents handing things off to presidents of the other party to paint them into corners. Trump did this to Biden. I'm sure Obama did this to Trump. Trump certainly instantly reversed a lot of stuff that Obama did in his last months in power. This is sort of traditional politics. But with Ukraine, we are, poking around with World War III. So it's not just the ATACMS, though I think you're right. The ATACMS is the biggest,
Yeah,
the
it's
biggest single.
current one recently, and also I think the Germans have one that goes 500 kilometers. The ATACMS goes 300. So, and that's getting close to Moscow, which is kind of what Vladimir Putin and his inner circle only care about.
Yeah. But I think the U.S. is definitely not. I mean, the U.S. it's more limited than that, than the 300 kilometers, right? Like the U.S. is like, isn't it just a couple of oblasts on the border or something? I didn't look into it, but which perhaps I should have.
But also, Russia was firing like intercontinental ballistic missiles into Ukraine. I think there were ones that potentially could have nuclear weapons in them, but the nuclear warheads have been taken out.
Well, yes, this is exactly what I'm talking. So, and that is a direct result of the choice to launch these attacks. So, in response to Biden's public determination that the U.S. will now let Ukraine use U.S. missiles in Russia, Russian government changed its nuclear use policy, which, it's just bureaucratic, and fired these ICBMs into Ukraine. My understanding is without much, not just without nuclear warheads, but without
A payload of,
any particularly heavy munitions.
I think you use the term kinetic when that's happening, when it's just the force of the speed and the weight of the missile is impacting.
And I think had tremendously horrible effects just being a missile of that size anyway. But like the insanity of discussion I've seen of that being, it doesn't mean a thing. Like, nah, man, it is the two countries with the potential to wipe out human civilization, like escalating what they're doing to each other. And that's just nuts. I really don't like it. But that's only one of a number of things that Biden has done here. There's the allowing the U.S. missiles. There is allowing U.S. contractors on the ground. There is allowing usage of landmines, which I think we might have discussed a little bit last time. And an additional $7 billion worth of stuff being distributed, all in the last days here. Now, it's easy to look at the U.S. contractors thing and be like, obviously there were already U.S. contractors on the ground.
Yeah.
It's easy to look at the landmines thing and be like, obviously the Ukrainians were already using landmines. Maybe they weren't U.S. landmines, but but it's just that it's that fog of no big deal is sort of what I wrote in my notes here. Like just this this idea that everything gets dismissed. Every step up the escalation ladder is like, oh, come on, they were already doing that. Oh, come on, it's not that big a deal. Oh, come on, that's Russia just being a big wuss, sending their ICBMs with no bombs in it. And oh, they changed the policy? Who cares? And that's how it'll feel. Like this isn't I've been surprised and pleased by how little, how few truly horrific situations have developed over the course of this 2-year war with Russia and Ukraine and U.S. supporting the Ukrainians.
Only nuclear power stations nearly getting hit with artillery.
Yeah. But when it happens, Rory, whether it's in the 2020s or the 2040s or the 2080s between, Poland and the UAE, I don't know. Whenever the nuclear war actually happens, and there will be a next nuclear war, it's going to feel exactly like this. It's going to feel exactly like, oh, well, they did this, but minimize that. That doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
They were doing that already. That's fine. Oops, the city's gone. That's how it's going to go.
Yeah.
And it's just so effing stupid that Russia and the United States are acting this immaturely. I think the United States is the vastly more powerful actor, bears more responsibility, but there's no question that Moscow and Washington, D.C. both have been acting like deranged children with no sense of respect or just honor for the idea that both of these capitals hold humanity's fate in their hands. And I think that's just sort of a broader point, I think, to be drawn from this whole Russia, Ukraine, U.S. triad over the past decade is just we are not gonna survive like as a human
Wow.
race, like because it's just like there was a great Twitter thread I saw and I reposted a couple days back. Just this guy making the point that like we're only like 80 years into humanity's nuclear era. I was reading a comic book this week talking about nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and it's a classic Alan Davis, Alan Moore strip called Miracle Man. And I was reflecting like this came out in 1982. That was like the halfway point of 40 years ago. Like half of the history of nuclear weapons has happened since this comic strip was written 40 years ago. It's just such a tiny period of time. And we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which in 1962, the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. 1962, just 7 years later, we had real chance of Kennedy and Khrushchev murdering human civilization, back down from. In the 1980s, there's a number of famous sort of misfires, from ridiculous things as like a flock of ducks. And I can't recall his name, but there's that famous Russian lieutenant who was like, actually, I don't think those are U.S. missiles, and like single-handedly
Yes.
saved humanity.
hmm
That's in the 1980s. Reagan like joking on like a radio show about, we're launching the missiles to Russia. And Russia being like, oh my God, like, like just like and we've had this, we've had a solid, since the 1980s, we've had this sense of like, well, mutually assured destruction, it's kind of off the table. But there's been this steady trickle of, I guess India and Pakistan got their missiles in the 70s, got their nukes in the 70s, but then North Korea, John Bolton created the North Korean nuclear program. It seems actually like this Iranian supreme leader is legitimately committed to not having nuclear weapons, but he's going to be dead soon. I just saw extraordinary arguments, not obviously from the Ukrainian government, but from Ukrainian supporters online. Well, if the United States doesn't give Ukraine, if Trump cuts off Ukraine, then Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. And it's just like, we're not going to make it
No.
as a species. It's like, because we'd be incredibly lucky if we make it through this century
hmm
without another nuclear exchange. Well, we've never had a nuclear exchange. We've just had the United States using nukes on Japan. But we'd be incredibly lucky if we made it through this century without some kind of limited nuclear exchange. And there's just no respect for this, and certainly no respect for this very real risk from Joe Biden, to bring it back to just Joe Biden and his insane lust for blood.
Is there much that he could have done looking back in his legacy at home? Because it does seem to be basic things like gas and groceries is really what did him down and is what really is hurting the average American. Like, why didn't he try to reduce that more other than just going after inflation, which he seems to have been successful at mostly?
Inflation has two parts,
Mm.
or multiple parts. It is pandemic era dislocation,
Yeah.
like that difficulty, supply chains, etc. But if he had actually negotiated with Putin and the conflict over Ukraine had not happened, which I believe he absolutely had the scope to do, and perhaps would have had the willingness to do before he got raked over the coals by the U.S. media for the Afghanistan
Well,
withdrawal.
because America did know it was going to happen. There's the whole thing with America giving the secret invasion plans to Ukraine. So they knew when it was going to happen, what was going to happen. So yeah, there is evidence that they could have maybe done something before then.
Yeah, like they knew. See, that's the thing. Biden knew it was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Biden knew and this is seen as
'Cause
this
he gives
big,
it- 'cause-
exciting.
Zelensky still sort of thinks like Russia's posturing at this point, and in what feels like a very sort of James Bondy moment, and the Americans are like, "Nope, here's the secret plans. They're going to invade here. This is what they're going to do." And obviously, then he's in panic stations at that point. So yeah, they knew it was going to
But
happen.
that's a phenomenal point, Rorik, and I'd forgotten about that because like in early 2022, or even into late 2022, when Ukraine had its staggering victories in Kharkiv and Kherson, we were like, America's back, and we should all be excited because the U.S. intelligence community got this so right, and like, aren't we brilliant? And like, puff pieces for the CIA and like, look, we knew, U.S. intelligence is back, baby. So like, but what all of that like indicates is, yeah, Joe Biden knew Russia wasn't bluffing. He knew. And at that point, he probably could have just been like, you know what? Let's not do NATO, and we're never doing NATO anyway. And like maybe things were too far along and that wouldn't have stopped Putin, but like just we're gonna, get back to the table, and we're gonna say as an opening thing, we're not gonna have Ukraine ever join NATO, and we're gonna commit to that. I think that could have averted the war. And if that war had been averted, the extraordinary spike in energy prices that basically, inflation was being beaten or dissipating, and then boom, in 2022. So it would have been one thing if inflation was something that had been defeated in late 2022. Instead, inflation was something that was defeated sort of in late 2023. And by that point, it was already too much of a known quantity of what the Biden administration was about. So yeah, there are plenty of domestic things. Biden was actually a domestically active and, I would argue, relatively successful president. People overstated a little bit, like, oh, he's just like LBJ, who did, extraordinarily things in the United States, like Medicare and the Civil Rights Act. I mean, Biden did nothing on that scale, but like LBJ, he was derailed by foreign policy.
But is it possible at that point he still had a lot of he was of sound mind, to use the legal term? And is it like it seems like after about 2 years, he's declined a lot and maybe possibly wasn't able to maneuver as quickly as he should have?
I suppose that's possible, but that's not a win column for the people who decided to elect
keep
Joe
him there.
Biden. Yeah, well, elect him in the first place in 2020. That's what I keep going back to. It's like, obviously the choice made in 2023 to run this corpse again. It was delusional, and everybody involved should be, never work in politics again because of it, including Kamala Harris. But I think the real original sin with Biden was just killing the Bernie campaign, using him to kill the Bernie campaign in the spring of 2020. That was the real point at which, if we had had Bernie, if we'd had a conscious Democrat of any kind, I don't think Trump would be president again. He would be more a historical curiosity than like the definer of this era of U.S. politics.
Do you think he will have done better than Trump will in his second term?
That's hard to say. That is very hard to say. Honestly, if Trump gets Ukraine like a decent deal in the next 6 months, he will be a more impressive foreign policy president than Biden. I really love that Biden got us out of Afghanistan, but like compare that to just the most direct responsibility that the United States has had for a genocide since the 1800s. Compare that to
this has completely destroyed America's reputation. Like we keep hearing about, Bernie Sanders saying the world's not going to take us serious, and it has just sort of destroyed my mind thinking about what's happening. And when you talk about historical events, and it's like, yeah, every medieval nonsense torture seems to be happening right now.
I wish that. I don't wish that were true, because I'm obviously a beneficiary of U.S. empire and will continue to be one. But I think from a moral sense of justice, I kind of wish that were true. Like I kind of wish that this was really the point where the United States
was
just committed so many crimes,
changed things.
Well, no, that the world was disgusted with what the U.S. was doing and the monstrous United States. I mean, if you look at what we were doing in Vietnam, if you look at there was in Indonesia, we bankrolled the murdering of 1 million sort of Chinese nationals in the 1960s. The whole history of the Cold War is not since the Cold War has there been anything as bad as what's happening in Israel right now. But during the Cold War, yeah, man, we were monstrous, and the world saw fit to continue to enjoy Hollywood movies and move on.
But is it more the fact the world doesn't have a choice? It has to deal with America?
Kind of, yeah. Certainly that's part of it. But also just I don't know. I've become less and less confident in the judgment of history. I think there's a lot of us who are sort of well, Biden will be judged by history, and it's just honestly, nobody will know who Biden. Biden will probably have a footnote of the nickname of Genocide Joe, but nobody's really going to think of him at all. Antony Blinken,
He'll just be the president in between 2 Trump terms.
Yeah. Blinken and all the just vile people who didn't resign over this genocide are going to just walk into great corporate boards and make money, and probably even at plush positions in international institutions and organizations, because the United States is still essential for all these things. I don't think there's going to be any long-term consequence for Genocide Joe and his foot soldiers. It is, which is a depressing place to end a depressing episode.
It is. And we'll catch you
Yeah.
next time with a slightly less depressing episode.
I just thought of something. Do you remember the Dark Brandon meme?
Yes. Is it I'm thinking of the Let's Go Brandon. It's not.
Well, so there was Let's Go Brandon, and then there was, especially around, I think, the 2022 election, there was this idea, I think actually it might have had its origin in some right-wing cartoon that had Joe Biden as this scary glowing-eyed monster or something. And it was
red eyes.
it was a funny joke for a while about Dark Brandon, and look at his economy coming back, and look at him not losing the midterms, and haha, Dark Brandon. It's funny, after October 7th, 2023, the imagining Joe Biden as a bloodthirsty dictator, conqueror figure. It's funny how that just sort of fell out of consciousness. People don't say, haha, this was for Democrats or liberals, haha, Dark Brandon did it again. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, we don't hear a lot about Dark Brandon after October 7th, do we? Because he actually is a genocidaire, mass murdering comic book villain. So yeah, we don't hear about Dark Brandon so much anymore. Just to make it a little darker, Rory.
We'll catch you next time about a country that's never done anything dark, the United Arab Emirates.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.